presentation. So let's make. Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to another session, the October 2017 session of Mountain Minds Monday. We're very excited to see this big crowd. It seems like whenever we have something that has to do with drones, we start breaking new records. And so today we're adding a little more extra to the drones. But we'll talk about this in a minute. I had mentioned before that we have sponsors who make this event possible. And I want to briefly talk about this New Leaders, a local web application and mobile application company who has been our longest standing sponsor, almost from day one. Not quite from day one, but I think from year one. And we are now 7.5 years old. So thank you to them. Holland & Hart, who has kind of been our second longest standing sponsor right now. And there's also a new representative of Holland & Hart here, Bob. Yeah, so a patent attorney, one of those specialties in Holland & Hart, a large and very qualified company. But there are more companies. There is Molesley and Bordner. Is that? I always hope that I get the name correct. Mobo Law. Also with a representative today here. So one sentence about your specialty, or?
I work in transactional and business matters when you family law and estate planning as well.
Yeah, thank you. And then co-working, the Lift. The Lift is not only sponsoring us, the Lift is also representing a milestone in the development of our ecosystem for entrepreneurs, a place to co-work. And in addition to that, we also have a sponsor that's actually not on the slide today. Part of it is because it's a one-time thing here. It's not co-working, but co-housing. And this is actually something I'm also particularly excited about because I'm a part of the initiative to bring co-housing. For those of you who don't know, co-housing means you build a set of houses, ideally close to downtown, that have a joint community space, that have a bunch of great properties. One is very energy efficient, walkable in the middle of the community space, like the cars park on the outside, and shared facilities where you can share meals together. There are guest rooms that you can share together. The workshop where you can build your things are shared. Toys from kayaks to all kind of things are shared. It's a great place for families, for people who have dogs, where somebody needs to watch the dog. A community that is living close by and combining the advantages of living in a traditional village with a private home ownership in that space of a modern home. And the reason why I'm excited, one of the reasons why I'm excited about that is that in that group of people who are interested in this, there are actually a whole bunch of people that are related to Tahoe Silicon Mountain, including myself. There's Jan, who introduced it here. There is Jamie, who last time presented as one of the entrepreneurs. Lauren here, one of our volunteers. Drew, of course, who did the next thing will probably be the logo for for Mountain Co-housing. Morgan, who is not here today, who has been presented, is interested, and he's of course also the mayor of our town. Trina, who is an individual sponsor, and here somewhere. So imagine kind of walking out of the door and meeting all those people. Unlike what happened to me last night when I walked out of the door and actually met a bear. I'm not kidding. Right in front of my house. So if you want to know more, talk to me.
Did the bear want to chat?
So I figured I prefer other type of company, actually. So, in addition, we have our community partners who help us in all kind of forms, like the Truckee Chamber of Commerce, Truckee, Tahoe Community Television, pay it if you pay with credit card here, Pizza on the Hill, who gives us this room, and the Roundhouse, who also produces things. The Roundhouse, yes. So thank you for all this, for all those sponsors. So, with having said this, we are here because the topic of drones is an interesting one. And let me give you a few reasons why I'm excited about this event and why this is interesting. First of all, it'll give all those high school students a reason to find out whether they are already far enough in math to do those serious things. So you'll have a few math formulas, and if there's any that you don't understand, then maybe you should put a little more effort in and take a few more classes. And so that's the one thing. Drones are so once my kids always wonder, like, why should I learn all that? And hey, here's an example why. Drones have always been cool because, like, from a toy perspective, these are cool toys. But really, what makes drones a lot more interesting these days is that they can become more and more intelligent, more and more independent, doing more and more difficult jobs, things that usually don't work because you can't put a human there, but then you need also intelligence there. And so I'm excited to introduce Christos Papachristos. Like myself, he studied most of his studies, or actually all of his formal education in his case, in Europe, and graduated 2015 from the University of Patras in Greece with a PhD, and has been for 1.5 years now at UNR as a researcher in the Autonomous Robots Lab. And today we'll learn a lot of cool things about what you can do in interesting situations with drones. But before you start, I extrapolate that in another hour, the oxygen will be gone. So here's the problem. If we open that door, it's going to be cold in that area, but I don't really see an alternative because if we don't, it's going to be, yeah, so if you can, at least most of the time, have it open, otherwise we will fall asleep, no matter what we're going to hear tonight. Okay, thank you. Welcome.
So, nice to meet you all. Good afternoon. I am Christos Papachristos, as already introduced. I work as a postdoctoral researcher at the Autonomous Robots Lab at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I'm here to tell you how, at the Autonomous Robots Lab, we arm aerial robots with the technology and the algorithms that allow them to navigate on their own, completely unknown environments that are able to, on their own, exact missions like that within environments that are dark, dangerous, and that they are even challenging, even for humans to navigate and conduct missions within. So the broader vision of the work that we conduct at the Autonomous Robots Lab has to do with the vision of a future where robots are everywhere within our societies. They are our forms of transportation, they are our security guards, police officers, they are our simple home appliances, or they are even entire networks and infrastructures of cities that are able, however, to function autonomously. So in such a future, robots are viewed as an integral component of human societies, and they can help promote sustainable, scalable growth, and even out societal disparities, bring better healthcare, promote our quality of lifestyle, and so on and so forth. But in order to be able to unlock this great level of potential of the future, we need robots that are able to function autonomously. So autonomy in all these concepts in this great future is the key. And in order to have systems, more generally, not just drones, but systems that are able to function with autonomy, the absolute baseline in order to do that is to have them to give them the ability to robustly perceive their environment and to be able to at least do their own planning, so reason what they are going to do next, take their own decisions. So apart from such a bright future, of course, there is a motivation today. And given the actual risks that exist in many industrial activities to human life, and given the fact that robots can act instead of human workers in many industrial sectors today, there exists great potential in their utilization today, and there is actually an urgent need to go fully autonomous in many operations as fast as we can. So there exist real application domains today, like the oil and gas industry, or generally remote infrastructure inspection, where robots can take the eyes of humans, or prospectively the eyes of themselves, to remote locations and conduct conduct work and operations where humans cannot reach. And even more importantly, they are able to go within hazardous locations, such as nuclear environments, which are contaminated and humans should never go near, and act in our stead, conduct missions in our stead. And all those industries have the need for robotics actually today, and there exist large financial benefits if those are achieved as fast as possible, considering especially that a week of operations in such industrial locations can, a week in cost savings in operations that are conducted by robots faster than what humans would do, corresponds to millions of accrued savings over a year. So in order to do that, we need to identify and put together the pieces that make a robot autonomous. So what is autonomy, first of all? It is the ability to operate without any need for human action and reasoning, and for the robot to be able to make its own choices, completely independent of any human action and reasoning. So in order to do that, we need to identify the baseline that allows us to do that. The first component is necessary in order to give it the ability to perceive and understand its own motion and the environment around it. It also needs a component to be able to control itself and its motion as it flies as efficiently as robustly as possible. And finally, at the top level lies the ability to plan its own actions in order to guarantee that certain objectives are achieved, whether it be exploration, inspection, or whatever other kind of objective that it might have, while following certain rules that have to do with its operation, like remaining in a collision-free state at all times, respecting endurance and power limitations, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to describe here, what I'm going to refer to, of course, I deal with drones, right? So all the examples that I'm going to refer to will consider a drone. We'll consider an actual, fully autonomous drone, and the minimal suite in order to give such a drone the ability to be autonomous is outlined right here. First of all, and deep and close to the robot, we need an autopilot, which is able to handle the fast attitude dynamics of the robot. And since the autopilot has its own state estimation and is able to make it fly smoothly enough, then we are able to take the onboard sensing, the purely onboard sensing of the robot, and take inertial sensors, and I'm going to elaborate about that, take inertial sensors and cameras and formulate what we call the visual inertial odometry pipeline and sensors. This is a sensor setup which allows it to make use of its own sensing, of its own onboard accelerations and rotational rates, and the information that it derives about its environment by using cameras and seeing what lies around it as it flies. So all this together they are able to give it the ability to also understand its own motion as it moves around. And then on top of that, we build with a highly efficient control strategy, which we call model predicted control. It's an optimal control strategy, which allows the vehicle to be very robust and very efficient in the way that it flies around. And finally, on top of that, at the highest level, the path planning module, which is responsible for feeding all the rest of the modules that I just described with where they should go, and it's responsible for deciding on the part of the robot what kind of waypoints and trajectories and motions it needs to do in order to be able to conduct its mission autonomously. The important thing here is that all those things are happening and are dealt with concurrently at the same time on board the robot. This right here is an i7 grade processor, which is of this small form factor. It can be integrated directly on the robot, and it's like much what a fully fledged laptop can do these days. So all these processes which are necessary in order to make the robot autonomous are handled on board the robot in real time. So let's go and attack one by one the actual challenges that are necessary in order to formulate such a module at any given time. So the first problem is the first and foremost problem of autonomous robots has to do with autonomous state estimation and perception. And the most challenging and the actual phrase that encompasses the challenges of all this thing is the phrase simultaneous localization and mapping. This is like a buzzword in the technological community. It has always been a buzzword because it refers to a great problem. What is localization? Localization is the process when you are given a map of your environment, like you know where everything is in your environment, and you have the absolute locations, the world points of everything in your environment, and you are then able to detect those entities which you are given within your map. And when I say entities, it can be objects or it can be features, so points on objects, and that's what I'm going to refer to. This is a computer vision-based approach to detect points of interest on an image plane and consider them as world landmarks. So if you are given the absolute locations of that with a map, then you are able to use what we call epipolar geometry, and with geometrical relationships, understand that you have moved from one absolute world position to another because exactly you know where everything lies. On the vice versa side, if you are given the absolute position of yourself, then you are able to make detections on the world around you, like detect points of interest, 3D landmarks, and put them on the map. This is called the process of mapping. But in an actual autonomous operation, you are given neither a map nor your own position. You're not expected to have GPS coordinates at all times. And this causes a chicken and egg problem. You are required to concurrently, at the same time, simultaneously, perform both localization without a map and mapping without your own pose. And this is a great problem. And the only way to approach that is to consider that those two processes, localization and mapping, are two processes which contain uncertainty. And by using a proper mathematical formulation, consider those two uncertain processes coupled together by the fact that there is a robot always observing those landmarks, and that those landmarks are always staying static within your environment. By assuming then the joint distribution of the uncertainties of those two processes, this allows us to fuse the information of how the robot flies around, how its own pose gets updated as it flies around, and fuse the information of the landmarks that it observes in its environment. So the process goes as follows. By moving within an environment and by having observed a couple of what we call landmarks, so imagine those 3D features, right? A corner, 2 corners, 3 corners on the desk and on the laptop. By moving around, we are able to introduce this motion parallax, as we say. We see them in a different position with respect to our own camera field of view, right? With this, we have seen them here initially, and by moving from here to there, we then view them from other locations. By then keeping track and updating the world locations of that based on the fact that they are viewed from the same robot as it has moved around, this allows us to concurrently estimate the uncertainty as it has progressed by seeing those things from now this position to concurrently co-estimate the updated uncertainty of those 3D landmark positions and the uncertainty about the robot having moved from this position to that position. So this all ends up to be a process which is repeated again and again and again over time, and essentially it serves to co-estimate at the same time how the world looks and how the world looks and is perceived by the robot, and where the robot is within its environment without any external information. It's what we can instinctively and intuitively do as humans ourselves. So what is a problem if you are able to do that whole thing and you are able to do this entire approach? One of the problems has to do with the fact that 2D projective geometry, so taking a 3-dimensional scene and projecting it onto a 2D image plane of a camera, loses part of the information. You're not able to tell on a 2D image plane whether you are seeing small objects, a small scale between some landmarks which you observe from up close, or whether you are seeing those large objects, a large scale from afar, since everything is projected on the same 2D image plane. And this causes the problem of the whole motion as it is tracked by the robot being recoverable up to a scale. This means that you are not able to tell whether you have moved 1 meter or 2 meters or 3 meters, but you are able to tell that from your initial configuration, you have moved by this much of a proportional, let's say, scale factor as you move around. This is a very difficult problem to address. And here, right here, comes in the point that I was making about having a unit, a perception module, which is not only visual, but is also inertial. This is the concept of visual inertial localization. Inertial sensors, inertial data, accelerations, and rotational rates, which are the things that detects even your smartphone device with its IMU unit, have absolute scale. They can be they have units of measurement like meters per second squared, and so on and so forth. So they have absolute scale. And if we take the previous said formulation and we reformulate the whole estimation process which I described in what is called an extended Kalman filter, we are able to take those inertial measurements and do the following thing with them. I don't know how many of you are aware of what a Kalman filter is. It is a process to estimate something which is uncertain, which goes in 2 phases. The first phase is that it tries, based on a model of the system, it tries to assume where it's going to move, where it has moved over some time. And then when a new measurement about the system comes in, it updates and corrects its own uncertain assumption. So we can take then these inertial measurements, which have an absolute scale, and use them in order to say that this vehicle has moved with this kind of accelerations and rotational rates being applied to it, and it has moved this far within the environment. That's the prediction step. That's the vehicle right here, the aerial robot right here, saying if I got this measurement, and this measurement, this measurement, these measurements, and this set of measurements within a time window, then it means that I have moved from here to there, from here to there, from here to there, and so on and so forth. This is, since those are noisy measurements, this is an uncertain process. However, it has scale in it. And now then, given the fact that this now has scale in it, right? Absolute scale in it. And it is coupled through the process that I described initially with the measurements that you take from the environment around you, then you are able, yes?
I just had a question.
Yes.
What is the frequency of your measurements and how?
So essentially, for the system that I'm describing so far, we have 200 hertz of measurements here, 200 hertz of the inertial measurements, and 20 hertz for the measurements here. So 20 hertz of capturing images of the environment. Right. So as Garrett noticed right here, we have two different rates at which those two steps operate. You have a number of inertial measurements which allow you to predict where your system has gone based on inertial data alone, but this process has a tendency to bloat its own uncertainty because they are very highly noised data and they are integrated over time. And then comes a step of a much slower process at 20 hertz, 20 times per second, of capturing images of the environment and saying that this thing that I viewed before at this location, then I am estimating that I see it from that location. So this is the correction step, which being coupled, these measurements with the state of the robot, allows us to concurrently do localization and mapping through this. This is an actual filtering approach which I've been describing so far. And of course, this is the absolute minimum baseline in order to do that. So given that, we can then build on top of it. The system that I've been describing so far has what is called a stereo sensor. And with a stereo sensor, you can do the following thing. You can, first of all, use the fact that you have a calibrated stereo camera. You know the actual absolute scale of the distance between your two cameras on the stereo sensor, and use it to recover the absolute scale of the thing that you are viewing ahead of you. That's the first thing that you can do. Second of all, by having what's called stereo matching, you can have a dense reconstruction and representation of the environment around you, because by seeing patches of the environment from your left and your right camera, you are able to do the same thing that your eyes and your brain naturally does. Recover the scale of what you see ahead of you, so recover the depth of the image that you see at any given point. Yes?
I just wonder what happens when there are moving objects in between.
Right. So this is a natural question. And it refers to two things. The first process is the one that you have been seeing up here, how it's able to track certain landmarks of the environment. And it is an assumption for the proper operation of this whole thing that those, both for the theoretical foundation of this thing, that those landmarks have to be static, right, in order for this thing to be able to converge to the reality of the whole thing. But since you have a bigger scene than actually a moving entity within it, you are able to do what we call outlier rejection. You are able to understand that something is moving with respect to the vast majority of your scene and reject it. Right? Of course, if somebody comes right at your face, that's going to cause problems, unless you have a camera on your back, and you can play around with those concepts. Right? So, but this 3D reconstruction, I mean, it is cool. It has a very aesthetically pleasing result, but it lacks one thing. It lacks efficiency. And here is how autonomous operation can tie in with efficiency. We can use, instead of the full 3D point cloud representation of the environment, which we can use to get meshes, which can then be used for inspection and so on and so forth. Instead of doing that, we can treat the environment as something that is segmented into small cubelets, or as we call them, voxels. So we segment the environment into a number of voxels which can either be occupied, so there exists a structure right there, or free, so they are part of the free environment, or they are unknown because I have not observed them thus far. So this is what we call volumetric mapping of the environment, and the actual framework that does that, and the most widely used framework, is called Octomap. It's a very efficient representation in memory, and it allows to do a number of things. It stores the entire environment in an octree structure, which allows you to do tricks like use hash table-based lookup, which is very fast in order to get you, given the 3D coordinates of a point in space, to get you the status and the actual voxel within the map representation that you're trying to look up. It's very computationally efficient, and computational efficiency might not matter in all occasions, but with real-time autonomy, which is the question here for our aerial robot, it matters. And here's how it ties in with the rest of the things. If you are able to quickly fetch the status of a 3D location, whether it's occupied, unknown, or free within such a volumetric representation, you are able to project also rays along which you check each point along this ray, whether it is occupied, whether it's segmented by an occupied voxel or not. This is called a process of ray casting. And first of all, it allows you, for instance, to understand whether along such a projected ray, and given a 3D landmark that lies behind here, if you have right there an occupied structure, you are not going to observe it. It's going to be occluded. This is a very fast operation given this implementation. Also, it allows you to do the following thing, to say that if I am to move from here to back there, then this is a move that doesn't make sense because it's going to cause me to collide with a structure in the environment. And this is something very fundamental that's used in order to conduct what we call autonomous path planning. Autonomous path planning is the process where the robot is called upon to decide on its own where it's going to move. And the fundamental process that is one of the core available processes which you can follow in order to do that is random sampling. So what is random sampling? Given the case of infinite possibilities for configurations to choose from for a robot, right? It can go here, or it can go 0.01 millimeters next to it, or even less, or even less. So there exists an infinite number of configurations to visit right here, and an even larger number of possible transitions to move through them. You say that I'm just going to evaluate a randomly sampled set. I will uniformly random sample from all the possible configurations and do the following thing. I'm going to reject points which lie within occupied regions of the environment, because obviously I'm going to collide with that region of the environment. And if I find myself to be at a non-colliding configuration right here, I'm going to try to connect this new point back to an already selected, previously selected point. But I'm only going to do that if there exists a transition between them which is collision-free. This, in turn, from all the randomly sampled poses configurations within the available space, builds up a tree. This is called a randomly exploring random tree, and it is a tree that randomly explores the full configuration space. This is one of with collision-free transition between all the possible configurations. This is one of the core components that we use for planning. The other core component is that naturally, since this is an ongoing mission, right, and if the robot takes an action and moves, it's going to discover even more of the environment. So its information about the environment, it's going to be updated. So it makes sense to not try to optimize as far as possible the previous step, but try to conduct at least a first move and get as much information of your environment as possible in, and then reevaluate your whole strategy. This is called a receding horizon strategy. You plan for a finite depth of moves. You plan for 10 steps forward in order to achieve an objective, but you only conduct the first step. And then based on the new information that comes in, you reevaluate your whole objective and you replan again and again and again. And this process is repeated until the objective is reached. So given this that we have established, first of all, what and how the robot is able to localize itself and produce its own map around it, and second of all, the architecture around which we build for it to be able to conduct autonomous planning, let's see an objective which defines a fully fledged autonomous mission with a bit of an extra flavoring. So consider the following problem. Consider that you take off with your drone from a completely unknown location. You have no idea where you have been placed, and you are required to fetch the complete map of the environment around you. So you are required to explore a completely unknown location. Second of all, consider that you are required not just to fully explore the environment, consider that you are also required to at least try to do that with the maximal localization and mapping accuracy. So be as consistent as possible you need about your map. So this is a problem that looks natural to us, right? You, of course, have to do it as best as you can, and you have to explore. But it is a very challenging problem if you consider the following. You take off at a location for which you know nothing about, and you are then required to compute the way, in some way, to optimize how you are going to move about that completely unknown environment and still be able to fetch the best map possible. There's no way to know that, right? You are taking off you are within something which you know nothing about, and based on that, because that's the basis of the environment itself is what's going to give you localization and mapping through the process which I described before. Based on something that you are not aware of, you are required to optimize also the entire behavior. So there's no golden hammer for that, right? So in this process, what we try to do is find the golden ratio between those two combined problems, which can be conflicting one with the other. We prioritize. We put everything in a hierarchical order, and we say that the first and prioritized objective over a long horizon is to explore the space. So we consider that there exists a first planning, autonomous planning layer of our system where the system is required to explore as much as possible of its surrounding environment. Explore means fetch information about the parts of the environment which it has not discovered, it has not seen so far. And in order to do this, we utilize an information gain. Of course, the information gain is a metric which allows us to see if we are going better or not in this process. And the information gain in this process is how much unexplored space we are discovering or we are expected to discover. So in this first objective, being more precise of how this thing goes, we utilize, first of all, the principle of random tree expansion. We expand the random tree, as I described before, in the already known space, not in the unknown space, exactly because if it is unknown, you are not allowed to go into unknown region. They might just be occupied, and you might cause it to collide. And from all these possible trees that are spanned through the entire space, we choose the best path based on the cumulative expected information gain. So cumulative means that along the entire branch of that path, how much information gain you are going to accrue as you move along it, and the information gain is how much unobserved space are you expected to observe. And this is a volumetric metric, right? You are expected to discover this amount of meters cubed. So given this best path, the path, i.e., that gives you the most information gain about the space that you see ahead of you, you execute just the first step. This is the receding horizon strategy that I mentioned. And then again, you repeat this process. So on top of that, yes, please.
I was just wondering, can you explain the variables in the visible volume?
This is the configuration. Oh, yeah. The variables in the expression right here is that the gain at the current point that we are evaluating equals to the gain at the previous one plus, so this is the concept of accruing information gain over a complete branch, plus what is visible, what is a visible part of the volume ahead of you, what is expected to be discovered from what is expected to be visible based on the camera sensor model. So given a camera, you are expected to have a cone which you can cover, right? From the current configuration where you're at, so X, Y, Z, and your orientation around. And there is this factor, which is a digressive coefficient factor, which makes sure that for very long segments, this thing does not just give a very high reward, exactly because a very long segment requires the vehicle to move too much, and we are following, after all, a receding horizon strategy. So on top of that, we can also build up another thing which is called reobservation gain. We can increase that gain in order to allow it to also estimate that it's going to rediscover parts of the environment which it has already seen before, but it has seen them with less probabilistic certainty of whether they are already occupied or not. So also improve the already existing environment understanding. This is the first layer of the entire process which I've been describing so far. Of course, there exists then the next layer which addresses the second problem. This is a nested optimization paradigm. Given the fact that you have decided from your first level that you are going to move from viewpoint A to viewpoint B in order to explore the space ahead of you, then you are, at this point, re-examining how you are going to move from point A to point B. And given a bounded area around this segment of motion, which you know that you are going to conduct in any case in order to explore, you are re-examining possible branches around it, which will lead to that final configuration, will lead to that final viewpoint, but by following different trajectories. And you choose what trajectory will lead to the one that that final viewpoint with the best possible, what we call, belief gain. So this belief gain is a measure of the uncertainty of localization and mapping as the process moves, as the robot moves. So we aim to get from A to B, which will lead us to exploration of the entire space, but we aim to get there through a way that leads us to the best localization and mapping accuracy. And how are we going to do that? remember this whole process that I've been describing of how the robot is able to localize itself within the environment, right? Use inertial data to propagate a model of itself, and then use visual data in order to pinpoint landmarks in its environment and correct that. You are actually, given the fact that you know landmark locations of your environment, and given the fact that you can assume a model of your system, a rigid body model of your system with closed loop dynamics, you are able to simulate what your inertial readings will be if you get from A to B with, for instance, a constant velocity. Then you are able to simulate what that process would do if it were to happen. And that's what the robot does in order to emulate what how its uncertainty is going to progress as it moves throughout this entire branch. It simulates inertial measurements about itself that it would derive if it were to follow that trajectory, and it simulates viewing or not viewing parts of the environment, landmarks in the environment, because of the viewpoint configuration that it will follow. Remember, trajectories are not just X, Y, Z locations, they are also orientations in 3D space. And this, in turn, leads up to a system which is able to use the exact same formulation that we've been following so far, the exact same thing that would happen if it were to follow this path, and understand which one of the available randomly generated paths is going to lead it to the best localization mapping accuracy. And in this process, it's also able to review the map that it has created so far and understand things like with ray casting, whether moving from A to B, it's going to, one part of the environment that it was viewing so far, a landmark, is going to be occluded by a part of the environment. It's able to do those things that we would instinctively do ourselves. So what this leads is to a process which identifies at the first level a very long path that cumulatively gives the best exploration gain about the unknown part of the environment, and around this first segment, we also derive an alternative way to get from this A to this B, which, however, leads up to this end configuration with the least possible uncertainty. How we evaluate that, since we propagate the uncertainty of the whole robot state, the position and the landmarks, the uncertainty of the position of the robot and the map that it's been building. We take what's called the de-optimality metric, and this is a metric that essentially says that we can represent, in at least a simpler representation, we can represent the uncertainty of such a thing with an uncertainty ellipsoid, right? And you say that with this plus minus this confidence interval, you are within that safety bubble, let's say, of being certain that you know your own location. So what this metric essentially says, which is the belief metric that we are using at the second level, is how big this uncertainty bubble really is. So we are able to use this mathematical expression and derive that. So the biggest problem in this whole thing, this is a very computationally efficient framework, but the biggest problem is, of course, the propagation of all the possible motions, which is the second layer. Still, we are able to do this whole thing in real time, and what you see here is the actual real-time operation of the entire system. As it flies around, it builds its own map, 3D reconstruction, but of course also this efficient representation, this octomap-based representation. And here it is replanning along the first, what you saw, these projections where the system itself projecting how its motion, possible motions that it could conduct from A to B, and what its uncertainty would look like going from A to B from all these possible trajectories. And henceforth, it again and again and again incorporates the new knowledge. Here, it evaluates all those things which are the available trajectory, which are within the allowed time interval that you can afford within a flight. Of course, it chose the straight line segment because that's also a valid, allowable possibility which can give larger confidence, and we also evaluate that, and the process results in this entire representation. So, however, this is just one part. I have a lot to talk about. Can we do it at the end? Is it, yeah?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. So I'm sorry about that. So this is just part of the things that I described at the beginning, of course. This is the autonomy when you have to do with the challenge of completely unknown environments and having to deal with your own limitations, like simultaneous localization mapping. However, there exists also other environments which pose new sets of challenges, like visually degraded environments, locations of the real world which can be engulfed in pure darkness, let's say, and be corridors which are very constrained. How would you go about that? You are required to re-examine what we call sensing modalities, the way that you can derive data from your environment. And thankfully, nowadays technology has a lot to offer in that respect. We are able to use time-of-flight 3D cameras and get a three-dimensional representation, a depth representation of what we see ahead of us. This is a USB stick-sized Kinect sensor, which you can incorporate on a drone very, very easily. It's able to give you three-dimensional reconstruction data from a current pose, and since you are able to move around and localize yourself as you move around, give you a 3D mapping of the environment. Also within a dark environment, there exist simple commercially available solutions which consist of near-infrared cameras with infrared LEDs for illumination of the scene. So you can use active sensing. So what's important about that? The important thing is that it ties well together with the process of active sensing or uncertainty-aware planning as I've been describing it so far. If you are to consider that, especially within such an environment, this is the same environment that you saw before, especially within such an environment which is dark, picking the right motions in order to be sure that you are going to see parts of the environment with a certain degree of localization and mapping accuracy is very important. It's not trivial. You cannot consider any part of the environment potentially visible. You are required actually to plan your own motions given the constraint that your uncertainty needs to remain at certain levels. And this is one first iteration of the whole process. The important thing is that by building generalizable solutions to problems, like the one I've been describing so far, can allow you to generalize also in other types of situations. This is an initial iteration of treating the whole localization and mapping and 3D reconstruction within visually degraded environments, and this is our current research and development work at the Autonomous Robots Lab. This is a camera, a stereo camera, hardware synchronized, with flashing LEDs, which are triggered at the point where the shutter of the camera opens in order to illuminate properly the scene, coupled with time-of-flight sensors, as I described so far, able to even integrate GPS data, and even generalize to multi-camera setups. So have a stereo perception unit ahead of you and another camera below you and multiple other cameras on your drone that are able to give you surround view, let's say, perception of the environment. This is a system which we have developed in-house, and we are using it in actual field experiments. So what you see here is the first iteration of our system within a tunnel within the city of Reno. It is a tunnel which is as visually degraded as it gets, right? But, however, the system is able, through the minimal sensor setup, the initial minimal sensor setup I described, to localize itself as it moves around and fetch an initial map of the environment. You see here what visually degraded means. Apart from the fact that it is fully engulfed in darkness, you cannot see past your own nose, right? There are dust particles flying all around. You need to keep the system robust against that, right? There are a lot of challenges in this whole process. This result right here, which I'm presenting here, is the current system which I've been describing so far. And this is a tunnel at Virginia City. It is a railroad tunnel which is used for tourist purposes. But essentially, here is a field deployment of this sensor on an actual autonomous robot, which is autonomously planning its trajectory around the tunnel, right, in order to explore the tunnel on its own and fetch the 3D reconstruction of the entire map on its own. This is a completely autonomous system which is able to operate, and as you see, it does operate in a visually degraded environment. And on top of that, let's see. This is 2 times the speed, but it still is not enough because all we are saying is that you actually cannot see past your nose, right? I promise you that. It was a very difficult day that day, but here is a 3D reconstruction which can be achieved. Also, this is with another system that uses LiDAR-based reconstruction, but the section that falls within the level of accuracy of the sensors that we were using looks also similar. Essentially, what you get here is the robotic capacity to do this sort of operation without the need for any human to be present anywhere near the robot. It is beyond visual line of sight operation. Finally, to close up, let's talk about hazard. So, nuclear hazard, it's a buzzword which is never going to go away in the foreseeable future, at least. There is a huge legacy of nuclear sites in the United States from some decades back that need to be decommissioned. And it's not as easy as saying it was a nuclear factory, right? So we can enter the nuclear factory and decommission the proper equipment. Some spaces, such as this, the Purex tunnel, is a space that was where nuclear waste was put in it, right? And it was sealed hermetically, and dust was laid over it, and it has never been opened since the 1960s. So this is a space, however, that given the fact that nuclear waste degrades also the quality of structural material around it, it needs to be inspected and decommissioned. How are you going to do that? Are you going to put people in that? I think that it's not a good idea if you can put robots in it, right? And it's all a matter of urgency, right? But why not strive to be able to put robots in those dirty, dull, and dangerous missions which have to do with decommissioning, inspection, all those things of assets and industrial locations which where human is the only one capable at this point in time of bringing into fruition. So this is part of our major project that we are running in coordination with the primary investigator being Carnegie Mellon University. This has to do with the characterization of DOE EM facilities, including nuclear analog facilities, the 3D structural monitoring and characterization of such facilities using only robotic means. So a couple of sensors that you can use in this respect in order to detect, for instance, gamma radiation, and given the fact that there exist, for instance, cameras, which, however, are very heavy radiation cameras to carry aboard the robot. However, there exist alternatives like what we call a scintillator unit or solid-state detectors of gamma radiation, which can actually be placed on board an aerial robot and detect radiation in real time as the robot flies in space. So a number of things needs to happen in order to make that a reality, of course. There is a pretty intricate characterization and calibration process, and you can even use the data that are coming in order to detect the energy of the gamma photons that are coming in, and hence be able to understand what kind of radioactive isotope you're looking at a location. There exist a number of very interesting possibilities, and also there exist other devices like neutron detectors and so on and so forth, which are also able to be incorporated on what we call a nuclearized autonomous aerial robot. It's a system that carries the same perception module which I've been describing so far, has the same autonomous perception and autonomous path planning capabilities that I've been describing so far. However, it also has the ability to characterize and understand its environment in terms of ionizing radiation. So I'm going to quickly skip forward to this thing. This is a set of preliminary results. This is a radiation source, and this is a robot which, by carrying only onboard sensors, of course, here the source is pretty obvious, right, to humans. But the robot can make no such assumption. It just relies on a scheme that makes it examine possible locations that will give it the best kind of possible localization accuracy of a radioactive source, essentially, let's put it in rough words, move around the possible location that it is, and finally pinpoint that radioactive source location just on its own. So hunt for nuclear radiation sources on its own. These are parts, I think I'm over with respect to time, right? So these are parts of our other research that is active. This has to do with detecting change within environments, whether it's on the two-dimensional level or the three-dimensional level. This has to do with being able to characterize an environment with respect to what pops out in terms of visual information in it, and hence drive yourself towards regions and examine regions as you fly around that look interesting, as abstract as that, right? You don't have to have an objective, like discover this sort of thing. You just fly around and look at interesting stuff. The robot on its own, what a human would do, imagine a robot doing that. And finally, some augmented reality where you're able to have a 3D projection of what the actual vehicle is seeing, annotated with operational data, and by just moving your head around, be able to jump in and redirect its attention towards where you want it to focus. So that's it. I'm sorry if I took too much of your time. I'm so sorry.
I have a question from Ken Gracie, who's watching the live stream. He's interested in knowing if this control system hardware and software is open source and available, or is this UNR research?
All right. So this is both UNR research and research conducted by other institutions, because all those packages, I cannot skip to the slide that I want to show, actually, but all those things that we are using are open source packages and implementations available all on GitHub with their own implementation. The actual planner that I've been showing is one of our most recent contributions. You may find it online. I've put a note mentioning the SLAM pipeline that we are using on one of the slides. It's called Rovio. All the framework that we're building upon is fully open source. Anybody at any given point who has the level of technological capacity can replicate it and have the system for your own in terms of algorithms, of course, because you also need to put together the actual hardware. Yes?
Do you have any research that you're doing which is for commercial entities, or they intended to be proprietary somehow to them because they funded? Are you confronting that issue?
We are, I cannot say much about that.
Okay.
We might be dedicating part of our visually degraded research in a specific application field, but let's say that the deal is not closed yet. But the actual field of visually degraded deployment of autonomous robots in beyond line of sight manner, no human presence required, and the robot just jumps in an environment which is very dark, very hazy, very dangerous in all sorts of ways, right? And it fetches a full 3D volumetric representation of what that environment looks like back to the operator, and then you are, of course, able to examine it image by image on yourself, is very hot with a lot of industries. Yes.
On the test you did with the radioactive materials, did you find that that had any impact on your robotics system and how they worked?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. The impact of nuclear radiation, of ionizing radiation on the robot itself. It had, at this level, it is not a level which is considered to be safe for humans to be nearby. So it required the safety officer of the university to turn on the radioactive source and so on and so forth. We could not be near that radioactive source. This is a very intricate process, let's say. But even at this level of radiation, the system was fine. Also, since we are characterizing all our systems, we put them in special chambers where they have to undergo even more higher doses of ionizing radiation. Even in those doses which are much higher than what you would expect in locations where radioactive waste lies, even in those, the robot is able to survive. Of course, you will get glitches, for instance, in cameras, right? You might even get a burnt pixel. But surprisingly, those systems are robust enough, not for too much of exposure, of course, right? Yeah. We know that Fukushima robots are dying all the time, right?
On that, have you looked at testing them in like magnetic fields? I've seen deep ransom systems at some mining sites where magnetic fields completely destroyed the systems, and that's...
Repeat the question, I think you didn't have the mic.
Yes.
No, actually, you need to.
Yes, yes. The question was on what the effect of high magnetic fields will be if the system actually operates within a field with large distortions, I assume, large magnetic distortions. And can I ask you what kind of testing procedure did you use in order to do that? So what were you evaluating?
Well, we were flying just to look at the characterized side.
Mm-hmm. It completely destroyed the system because it was a commercial system, most probably, that relied most probably for its state estimation on magnetometer data, right? So what I've been describing so far requires absolutely no magnetic inference of the environment. It requires no magnetometer to be present. It only requires onboard inertial data you wouldn't expect. So what you measure essentially for a smoothly flying free-flying robot, what you are measuring is the direction of the gravity vector of the Earth, right, with an inertial measurement unit. You wouldn't expect that to have large deviations anywhere, like near a mine or anything like that, obviously, right? You're not near a black hole or anything like that. So, so this is a pretty robust sensor in that sense. Since all it's doing is infer the direction, let's say, of the gravity vector, it is very robust. Also, if you are able to provide light towards your environment, so actively illuminate your scene and have the visual sensor capacity as a backend, as I've been describing, then you are able to run visual inertial only localization, no magnetometer in that, and maintain your localization mapping accuracy. So your solution lies in dropping something that is very highly impacted by large magnetic distortions, which is a very simple commercial platform. Yes. It is, we are able to do that. Yes.
So my question is, how does this happen in neurobiology? How do our brains do this? So if somebody's taken blindfolded into a room they've never been before, the blindfold's removed, and they're told to find the door, they get up and find the door, but are our brains actually doing the same kind of impressive mathematics subconsciously, where we're doing all the simulation and mapping?
Well, we are a set of neural networks at the very end. We are very well trained to look at a number of things. Of course, we are able to infer the basic mathematics, let's say, the basic foundations behind what I've been describing so far, and the brain is able to fuse inertial information coming from your ears, right? And fuse that with visual information as you are looking around you, and fuse that with odometry information as you're moving around with your feet. All those things are happening concurrently. And you're also trained to look at environments that look approximately the same, like you are expected to find yourself in a room that would have a door, and you know what a door looks like. So these are like very abstract questions, find the exit from the room, that involve a number of things. What we are working on, and this is what I've been describing so far, is the baseline for autonomy. What, given, even if you don't have like a given objective a priori, right, you are able to conduct a mission on your own and plug into that capacity then what you want to do. For instance, you are able to take a Tegra board, which is an NVIDIA board, right, which will be running some sort of learning algorithm, and detect doors, detect fire extinguishers, detect stuff in the environment. But the baseline in order to do that within an unknown environment is that you first need to take off, then you need to explore your space in order to be able to say that, okay, I've seen what exists from the available space, and I haven't found the door, or I have found the door. And then that extra add-on module, which is the learned module of what a door looks like, will be able to eventually, if such a door exists, pinpoint the door itself.
Thanks. I suspect our brains are actually doing a lot of that very, very
fast. A lot of that, yes.
Oh, so I noticed that the use of multimodal sensors all integrated to create a map, and you showed different examples of being able to bring radiation to place on top of that map as well.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious about the fusing of one drone's map with another drone's map, and how the use of swarms could either make this like a joint tasking and like creating a shared space, and how that would be done with sort of relative inertial frames.
Yes, this is an actual place of current ongoing research, not at our lab. We're not doing that at this time, but I can pinpoint you to some resources about that. But yes, this essentially requires registration of map to map, which can happen on multiple bases. It can happen on a volumetric basis, right? You can find the structure and map, align the volumetric structure of one map to the other, given that there is no underlying change, which is also part of the game. You might be seeing part of the map with a different drone, but at a different epoch, so it has undergone change. And it can happen at the feature level, so you're able to derive landmark locations within the map that you have discovered from one drone and cross-check them with landmarks that you have derived from another drone, and share that mapping information and be able to put one map on top of the other. Those are current approaches which actually take place, and it's research that is happening, but it corresponds to actual results that exist right now. There are actual research groups which are doing that.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes. So I think we're coming to the point where the classic school lesson would be over, and so Just a quick question. You mentioned UNR, Carnegie Mellon. So can you say a few words of who's doing the research, where UNR is in this? Like, is it one of the leading institutions in
for this specific project, this UNR is subcontracted, but the research is shared. The research on the systems side is mostly Carnegie Mellon. We are doing the research on the path planning side with semantic enhancement and characterization of the environment. So more broadly, the area that I've been describing throughout this talk. So what I've been talking about is highly relevant with the actual research that goes on at UNR for nuclear site characterization and mapping. Yes.
Thank you. So there's very serious stuff going on.
Yes,
right,
there is
right
very
down the hill.
stuff.
Okay, so thank you. This was wonderful. Did I ever mention that my master's degree is in automation and control? So a lot of it kind of brought back memories, even though I'm not in the field right now anymore. So
Kalman
really,
filters, right?
really fascinating.
Kalman filters, right?
Kalman filters. Oh yes, here they are again. So thank you. I hope you all enjoyed this, and if you have more in-depth questions, maybe you're around for a few more minutes to do this.
I'll be around.
Okay.
Yes.